the summer of 1945. The war had ended, yet the world remained trembling in its wake. As evening descended, the sky burned with the fading glow of sunset, and a group of exhausted German women prisoners received their orders. Step outside. Their uniforms hung loosely from gaunt frames. Their boots caked in mud felt heavy with something more than weight, with fear itself. The air lay still, unnervingly so. Only the crunch of boots on gravel broke the silence. "Line up," came the command. The women exchanged anxious glances, their faces drawn with fatigue and uncertainty. Rumours had circulated. Some whispered it was merely roll call. Others spoke of darker possibilities. War had stripped them of certainty, and in captivity, even silence carried menace. As the sun slipped towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the compound, they stood shoulder to shoulder. Mothers, nurses, clerks, soldiers. The crimson-orange light bathed them in an almost surreal glow. For a moment, no one breathed. Then something began to unfold. Something none of them had anticipated. Before we go on, if you enjoy these untold stories from history, do consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Instead of punishment, there was music, voices, movement. Before their weary eyes, the very soldiers who had captured them began to do something that shattered every preconception they'd held of their enemy. That evening at sunset, these women witnessed a side of humanity they believed the war had erased entirely. From that moment on, they would never forget what unfolded before them in that golden light. The guards had ordered them to line up, every single one, from the youngest to the oldest. The command came sharply, cutting through the still air like a whip crack. The sun was already sinking low, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. For the women inside the camp, that order, line up, was one they'd learnt to dread. It always meant something. Sometimes inspection, sometimes punishment. Sometimes it meant someone would be taken away and never seen again. Boots shuffled across hard-packed earth as the women emerged from the barracks, one by one, their expressions cautious and guarded. They formed uneven rows, adjusting worn coats against the cool evening breeze. The smell of dust mingled with the faint metallic scent from the camp's fences. Beyond the wire, fields stretched towards the horizon, fading into the golden glow of dusk. Somewhere far off, a bird called once, then fell silent. The war had ended months earlier, but for these women, the cessation of fighting hadn't meant the end of fear. They were prisoners now, captured German auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, a few former soldiers. Some had served the regime willingly. Others had simply been swept up by the machinery of war. Here in this isolated Allied camp, none of that mattered anymore. They were simply the prisoners. As they stood in line, a murmur rippled through the ranks. "Why at sunset?" one whispered, her voice trembling. "Perhaps another roll call," another replied. "Or a transfer," a third ventured, though she didn't sound convinced. A particular tension thrummed beneath the surface of every breath. A guard paced before them, his uniform crisp but dusty from the day's heat. He didn't shout or bark orders. He simply walked, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. Then he stopped, turned towards the main gate, and raised his hand in silent signal. The massive wooden gate creaked open. Every head turned. The sound alone was enough to quicken their hearts. Normally it meant lorries, or more guards, or something worse. But not this time. What entered the camp wasn't a column of soldiers carrying rifles. It was a small group of men in Allied uniforms, carrying, rather strangely, musical instruments, a battered drum, a harmonica, a violin with a cracked bridge, a dented trumpet. The prisoners stared in disbelief. Some blinked as though their eyes were deceiving them. One woman even whispered, "Are they mocking us?" The men walked to the center of the yard. The one with the harmonica raised it slowly to his lips. A faint note floated across the still air, soft, uncertain, trembling at first. Then another. Then the first line of a melody that was hauntingly familiar. It wasn't a military march. It wasn't even a song of victory or triumph. It was an old tune, a folk song, simple, wistful, and unmistakably German. For a moment, no one breathed. The women froze, eyes wide, chests tight. The melody drifted through the yard, delicate as memory. A young woman near the front of the line, her name was Lotta, felt her throat tighten. She had heard that song as a child, long before the war, sung by her mother whilst baking bread in their small kitchen. That same song had once meant safety, home, warmth, and now played by Allied ants, it felt like a ghost reaching out through the ashes of her past. The harmonica was joined by the violin, its thin bow sliding gently across the strings. The tune deepened, filled with something mournful, yet strangely comforting. The women exchanged glances, unsure how to react. Should they look away? Should they smile? Should they cry? The guards stood silently along the fence line, watching, saying nothing. One woman, a former nurse, covered her mouth with her hand, tears brimming in her eyes. She'd treated wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front, where screams and explosions had replaced music long ago. To hear a song again, played not for glory but for peace, was something she could scarcely comprehend. If you're finding this fascinating, do hit subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories like this. The men played on. The sun continued its slow descent, bathing everything in golden light. Dust particles danced, swirling gently like drifting memories. The camp, usually filled with the sounds of boots, shouts, and clanging tin cups, was silent except for the music. Even the guards seemed lost in it. When the final note of the harmonica faded into the air, the lead soldier lowered his instrument. There was no applause, no command, no explanation, only stillness. Then he reached into a canvas sack at his side and pulled out a small loaf of bread. He tore it in half and placed one piece on the ground just beyond the line of prisoners. Another soldier followed his lead, setting down another loaf, then another. Soon there were several small piles of bread along the row. The women hesitated. They didn't move forwards. They didn't dare. But one guard gave a small nod, a gesture of permission. Slowly, uncertainly, the women stepped forwards. Some reached out with trembling hands. Others hung back, too stunned to move. Lotta picked up her piece. The crust was warm, soft. She hadn't held fresh bread in months. The smell hit her first, rich, earthy, real. She broke it in two and handed half to the woman beside her. The gesture passed down the line, silent but powerful. For a few moments, there were no prisoners and no captors. Just human beings sharing something simple and sacred. The soldiers said nothing. They stood watching. The sun set behind them, turning their silhouettes into outlines of light and shadow. The air felt different now, lighter somehow. The fear that had hung over the camp like a storm cloud seemed to drift away. One of the Allied soldiers began to hum quietly, a low, slow tune that blended with the rustle of evening wind. It wasn't German this time, nor English. It was something universal, something that didn't belong to any flag or language. The women listened, clutching their bread, eyes shining in the fading light. It was in that moment that many of them realized something profound. Compassion had survived the war. It hadn't been bombed out or buried beneath ruins. It was still there, alive in the smallest gestures, in music, in food, in the quiet refusal to hate. For years they'd been told that their enemies were monsters, that mercy was weakness. But here, standing in a line at sunset, they saw that the opposite was true. Mercy was strength. Humanity was resilience. And even after everything, after loss, defeat, and despair, there was still room for grace. When the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, the camp was quiet again. The guards dismissed them without a word. The women returned to their barracks, holding on to their small pieces of bread as though they were relics. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. That night, As darkness settled and the stars appeared, Lotta lay awake on her bunk. The melody still played in her mind, over and over. For the first time since the war began, she didn't feel hollow. She felt human, and that was enough. Some of the women began to cry, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Their eyes, dulled by months of hardship, suddenly seemed alive again, flickering with something they hadn't felt in so long, hope. The sunset deepened into fiery orange, and the golden light glowed on their tired faces as they watched the Allied soldiers move amongst them. None of them had expected kindness. None had even imagined it possible. For so long, these women had been taught that the enemy was brutal, heartless, without mercy. The propaganda posters, the speeches, the whispers, they'd built an image of the Allied forces as monsters who would crush them without hesitation. But now, as the soldiers moved quietly through the line, offering food and drink instead of punishment, that image began to crumble. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, a scent that seemed almost out of place. One of the soldiers, a tall man with a sunburnt face and dirt on his sleeves, carried a small tin kettle in one hand and a stack of cups in the other. Steam rose gently from the spout. Coffee! The women could smell it before they even saw it. For a moment no one dared move, afraid it was some kind of trick. But when the man stopped before the first woman, a nurse with trembling hands and hollow cheeks, he smiled faintly and poured the dark liquid into a cup. Then wordlessly, he offered it to her. Her hand shook as she took it. She hadn't tasted coffee since the winter of 1944. Back then, her hospital had run on barley substitutes and watery soups. Now the warmth of it seeped through her fingers, and when she lifted it to her lips, the smell alone brought tears to her eyes. She sipped carefully, as though afraid the moment might vanish. The taste was bitter, smoky, real. It was like drinking life itself. A murmur rippled down the line. The soldiers continued handing out more cups, breaking loaves of bread into smaller pieces so that everyone could have at least a bite. It wasn't much, just a crust, a sip. But in that place, in that moment, it was everything. Lotta watched as an older woman, Fräulein Becker, who'd been a schoolteacher before the war, clutched her bread to her chest like a treasure. She turned to the young girl beside her and split it in half, pressing one piece into her hands. The girl smiled weakly, her lips trembling. No one spoke. The sound of crackling firewood somewhere in the distance was the only thing that broke the silence. The soldiers didn't talk much either. They moved slowly, quietly, like men who understood the weight of what they were doing. There were no mocking smiles, no words of victory, just gestures. Simple human gestures that spoke louder than speeches ever could. One of them, a young private no older than 20, caught Lotta's eye. For a brief second, she saw something in his expression, a kind of exhaustion that mirrored her own. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that they were both just people who'd survived something bigger than themselves. When he handed her a small piece of bread, she whispered, "Danke." He didn't understand the word, but he smiled anyway. The smell of coffee drifted through the camp, blending with the cool evening air. Some of the women began to whisper prayers. Others simply stood in stunned silence, staring at the bread in their hands, as though afraid it would vanish if they blinked. For so many months, they'd lived on watery soup, dried potatoes, and silence. Now the rich taste of something warm and kind filled their mouths, and it overwhelmed them. Tears began to fall freely. Not one of the women tried to hide them. They were tears of disbelief, of release, of something deep and buried finally breaking free. One nurse turned her face to the sky and closed her eyes. She could feel the last rays of the sun on her cheeks. For a moment, she imagined she was home again, in her small town, sitting by the window with her mother, drinking coffee from a chipped porcelain cup, the sound of laughter, the smell of bread, the sight of peace. All the things the war had taken flooded back in a rush of aching memory. Nearby, two younger prisoners huddled close together, sharing what little they'd been given. One broke her crust into crumbs to feed a small sparrow that had landed near her feet. The bird pecked fearlessly, its tiny movements delicate and quick. The women smiled. Even the smallest life seemed like a miracle in that place. The guards at the edge of the yard said nothing. A few exchanged quiet glances, but didn't interfere. Perhaps they too understood that what was happening was something rare. A pause in the endless machinery of war. A moment of grace. The sun sank lower. Shadows stretched across the camp, long and soft. The last light caught the wire fences, making them glint like strands of gold instead of prison bars. For the first time, the place didn't feel entirely like a cage. A quick note: if you're enjoying this, subscribing really does make a difference. Now back to the story. Somewhere near the back of the line, a woman began to hum. It was faint at first, a melody barely louder than a whisper, but others soon joined her, hesitantly, quietly. The tune was the same one the soldiers had played earlier on the harmonica. Now it passed from voice to voice, blending with the sound of the evening wind. The song didn't belong to anyone. It belonged to everyone who still believed in the possibility of goodness after so much evil. The soldiers listened. One of them even smiled softly, his eyes glinting in the dying light. For a moment, there were no sides. No victors or vanquished. Just human beings breathing the same air, standing in the same fading light, sharing the same fragile peace. And yet, beneath that peace lay something deeper, an understanding of how easily it could have gone another way. Each woman there knew what war had done to people, how easily hatred could take root. Each soldier knew what he'd seen on the battlefields, the devastation, the cruelty, the senseless loss. Perhaps that was what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't ignorance of darkness that made it beautiful, but the decision to create light despite it. The women continued to eat in silence, every bite tasting like memory. One thought of her husband who never returned from Stalingrad, another of her child lost in a bombing raid, another of the friends she'd left behind. The bread didn't erase the pain, but it reminded them that pain wasn't all there was. There could still be kindness. There could still be warmth. As the last cups of coffee were passed out, the air grew cooler. The orange glow deepened into red, and the world seemed suspended between day and night, war and peace, despair and healing. The women lingered unwilling to return to the barracks just yet. The guards allowed it. No one wanted to break the spell. Lotta looked down at her cup, nearly empty now, then at the soldier who'd given it to her. He was talking quietly with one of his comrades, their faces serious but gentle. She wondered what he'd seen during the war. Perhaps he'd lost friends too. Perhaps he was as haunted as she was. In that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt since before the war, a strange cautious respect, not for authority or power, but for the simple act of being human, for the courage it took to be kind when hatred was easier. The sun finally touched the horizon, and the world turned amber and violet. The last note of the day seemed to hang in the air like a breath waiting to be released. The music, the warmth, the smell of coffee, all of it fused into something timeless. When the soldiers began to collect their instruments again, there were no words exchanged. There didn't need to be. The silence spoke enough. It said, "This is who we could be." When the women were finally told to return to their barracks, they did so slowly, carrying with them not just bread or coffee, but something invisible, something that lingered in their hearts long after the gates closed behind them. That night, as they lay in their bunks, the smell of coffee still clinging faintly to their hands, none of them could sleep. Some cried quietly into their pillows. Others simply stared at the wooden ceiling, thinking of the sunset and the strange kindness they'd witnessed. They'd expected cruelty, punishment, perhaps even death. Instead, they'd been given a gift so simple it felt impossible, a moment of shared humanity. and it had come not from words or promises, but from actions. The breaking of bread, the pouring of coffee, the sound of a familiar song at sunset. It was a lesson none of them would forget. Years later, when they would tell their children or grandchildren about the war, they wouldn't only speak of suffering, they would tell them about that evening, about how their captors, their so-called enemies, had reminded them what it meant to be human again. As they drifted into uneasy dreams, they carried that image with them. The image of men and women standing together under a crimson sky, sharing warmth instead of hatred, peace instead of vengeance. As the harmonica's final notes faded into the violet horizon, the camp fell into a silence that felt different. No longer the heavy, fearful silence of uncertainty, but something gentler, something alive. The last light of the sun rested on the faces of the women who stood in that open yard, each of them frozen in the quiet awe of what they'd just experienced. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, as if the entire world was trying to remember this rare, fragile peace. Lotta lowered her cup slowly, the last drop of coffee still warm against her palms. Around her, other women did the same. Some stood with their eyes closed. Others simply stared ahead, their faces soft in the fading glow. The soldiers who played, who'd handed out bread and kindness, now began to collect their instruments and step back. They didn't smile triumphantly or speak words of farewell. They just stood there for a while, watching the women as if they too didn't want to break the spell that hung in the air. For a brief moment, it didn't feel like a prison anymore. The barbed wire fences glowed faintly in the twilight, and the guards, instead of looming like shadows of authority, looked almost human. Just men in uniforms, weary from the same war that had broken everyone else. The orange light turned their silhouettes gold, and the echoes of the music still drifted faintly through the dust-filled air, mingling with the scent of warm bread and smoke. Then one of the women, Fräulein Becker, took a hesitant step forwards. Her hands trembled as she pressed them together, and her lips moved soundlessly before a whisper finally escaped her. Danke. Her voice was small, fragile, but it carried. It floated through the yard like a prayer. A few others repeated it, their voices overlapping softly. Danke, danke. The soldiers didn't answer, but they heard. One of them looked away, blinking hard as if fighting back something in his throat. Another reached for his canteen, pretending to drink, though his eyes were fixed on the horizon. The women stood there until the guards finally motioned for them to return to their barracks. Even then they moved slowly, almost reluctantly, each one clutching a piece of bread or her empty cup as though afraid that leaving the yard would somehow make the moment vanish. As they walked back across the dusty ground, the sound of their boots blended with a chirping of crickets in the distance. The war had taken so much from them, their homes, their families, their dignity. But tonight, in the unlikeliest of places, they'd been given something back. Something they hadn't realized they were starving for, the feeling that the world could still be good. Inside the barracks, the air was cool and quiet. A few of the women sat on their bunks in silence, still lost in thought. Others lay down but didn't close their eyes. The walls, rough and splintered, seemed softer somehow. Even the flickering oil lamps on the tables looked warmer than before. Lotta sat by the small window near her bed, staring out at the yard. The last traces of sunlight had disappeared, leaving behind a sky full of stars. She couldn't remember the last time she had looked up at the stars. During the war, she had avoided them. They'd only reminded her of nights spent under bombing raids, of fires and falling glass. But now they seemed peaceful again, eternal, unchanged. The harmonica melody still lingered in her mind. She hummed it quietly, her voice trembling but steady. The sound drew the attention of the woman lying on the bunk beside her, who smiled faintly and whispered, "You have a lovely voice." Lotta blushed, shaking her head. "No," she said softly. "It's just the song. It's still here." The other woman nodded, her eyes glistening. Perhaps it's supposed to stay, she said. Perhaps it's what we need to remember. Hours passed before anyone fell asleep. Some of the women wept softly, not from sorrow, but from the flood of memories that kindness had unlocked. They thought of their families, the children they hadn't seen in years, the husbands who would never return, the mothers who'd once sung them to sleep. Others thought of the soldiers they'd just seen, wondering what stories lay behind their calm faces. Had they lost someone too? Had they felt hatred, grief, despair the same way? It was strange to think of their captors as men with hearts. Men who could play music and hand out bread. But now they'd seen it with their own eyes, and it had changed something inside them. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Please do subscribe. The next morning, the camp was quieter than usual. The women moved differently, slower, gentler, as though afraid to shatter the fragile peace that had been born the night before. Even the guards seemed subdued, their voices lower, their expressions less severe. When the breakfast rations were handed out, thin porridge and a small slice of stale bread, no one complained. No one looked bitter. It wasn't that they were content. It was that they'd been reminded that contentment was still possible. Later that day, as Lotta fetched water from the pump, she caught sight of one of the Allied soldiers who played the harmonica. He was standing near the fence, talking quietly with another guard. Their laughter was faint, but it wasn't cruel. It was the sound of men trying to return to normal life after too many years of chaos. When he noticed her watching, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement, the same as before. She hesitated, then nodded back. It was a simple exchange, but one that felt like a bridge across an invisible divide. That evening, as the sun began to set again, the camp yard glowed with the same golden hue as the night before. The women gathered near the barracks, not because they were ordered to this time, but because they wanted to see it, to stand together and watch the light fade. The war had made them forget how beautiful a sunset could be. For years, twilight had meant danger, air raids, darkness. But now, as the light bathed the world in calm warmth, they felt something close to peace. The harmonica player didn't return that night, but the memory of his music was enough. A few of the women hummed the melody under their breath. One even began to softly sing the words that matched the tune. A song about longing, about home, about waiting for someone to return. The others joined in. The sound was fragile but sincere, floating over the fences, rising into the cooling air. The guards listened quietly, their faces unreadable. None of them tried to stop it. And then as the song faded, the sky shifted into deep blue. The first stars appeared again, flickering like distant lanterns. The camp fell into silence once more, but now it was a different kind of silence. It was full of unspoken understanding. That night lying on her bunk, Lotta thought of everything she'd lost. Her brother had died in Russia. Her father had vanished after a bombing in Hamburg. Her mother had been buried under rubble during an air raid. For years she'd carried bitterness like a shield, believing that to forgive the enemy would be to betray their memory. But after what she'd seen, she wasn't so sure anymore. Perhaps forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. Perhaps it simply meant allowing herself to live again. Outside, a soft wind rustled through the trees beyond the fence. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The world, it seemed, had gone back to breathing again. In the weeks that followed, the camp remained a place of captivity, but not of cruelty. The soldiers treated the prisoners with respect. Work continued, cleaning, repairing, cooking, but it was no longer done under the weight of fear. The women spoke quietly amongst themselves, telling stories, sharing small pieces of hope. Some of them even began teaching each other languages, songs, memories of home. The moment at sunset became a kind of legend amongst them. They spoke of it in whispers, always the same way. Do you remember that night? The music, the bread, the coffee. It became their reminder that even in the ruins of everything, humanity hadn't completely died. When the war trials began and the world outside their fences turned to questions of guilt and justice, the women still carried that evening in their hearts. They didn't deny the horrors of what had happened. They knew too well what had been done, but they also knew that one act of mercy, one moment of unexpected compassion, could outlive hatred. Years later, after they were released and returned to what remained of their homes, some of them still kept small tokens from that time. A tin cup, a crust of preserved bread, a scrap of paper with the song's lyrics. They would show them to their children and grandchildren and say, "This was from the day I learnt that even enemies can be kind." And in those retellings, the golden evening lived on, not as a story of prisoners and captors, but as a story of people finding their way back to humanity after losing it for so long. Even decades later, whenever Lotta saw the sun setting and the sky turning gold, she would stop and remember. That yard, that music, those faces. She would remember how the world had paused between light and darkness and chosen, if only for a moment, to be good.